2024 is looking absolutely massive for video game releases. So with much anticipated titles such as Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, as well as S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 and Star Wars Outlaws, we thought it would be appropriate to give you a rundown on the biggest upcoming games of the year, as well as our predictions as to whether or not they'll be any good.
Starting with one of the most controversial and the closest release on this list, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, meaning that we're either going to be proven wrong or proven right very quickly after this video comes out.
So of course, this is from the critically acclaimed developers of the Batman Arkham trilogy, so it's in pretty safe hands, or at least we thought, until the founders left the studio to form their own game development company just a couple of years ago. So there's a bit of concern there, but they were at least around for most of the development. But it does seem like this has had quite the tumultuous development cycle, with leaks coming out about battle passes and live service elements that people weren't happy about, and even gameplay reveals that were seen as quite disappointing. But honestly, the more recent stuff that's been coming out has eased my doubts just a little bit. Of course, it looks good visually, that was a given from the very beginning. You're getting to play as 4 of some of the most iconic Suicide Squad members, of course King Shark, Harley Quinn, Deadshot, and Captain Boomerang, and it's in the city of Metropolis, home to some of the most iconic superheroes of all time. But the twist is that you're actually fighting against them. So we've seen in gameplay demos, you'll be coming up against heroes such as Superman, Green Lantern, and the Flash, as well as plenty more, I assume. So from the standpoint of setting up the story, it does seem really interesting. Whether they'll be able to pull it off is another matter entirely.
So on the topic of the live service element of the game, what I've seen that I quite like is that they're going to kind of take a seasonal approach, which at first is kind of controversial, but every single part of it is free, with the first release being Joker himself as a playable character. And also it seems that the only microtransaction in the live service element of the game is cosmetics. So I think the kind of initial outrage about microtransactions will be reduced a bit once the game actually comes out, especially since once again the new characters themselves are completely free. Overall, this is a unique jump into the superhero genre, and I think if Rocksteady Games can stick the landing, then I think we might be pleasantly surprised by Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League.
Helldivers 2 is the long-awaited sequel to 2015's top-down co-op shooter.
Going into this game, you'll be woken up from a cryogenically frozen sleep. You'll travel around to different planets fighting all types of different aliens and monsters, strategizing on your ship before you go in. And making this even more exciting, it supports up to 4-player co-op. If all goes well, the original formula will stay intact, whilst adapting to the medium of third-person shooter.
It also seems to feature an operations system which should help with replayability, allowing you to choose planets and enemies and complete challenges and secondary objectives to earn extra items and rewards. Hopefully, with this extra dimension offered by the switch to third person, the strategic element can be even further enhanced. And if all goes well, we should be able to play this for a very long time.
Next on this list is one of the most delayed games, not just of this list, but of all time, Skull and Bones. It's a co-op pirate game, similar to titles such as Sea of Thieves. However, this time it's made by Ubisoft.
And interestingly, it did actually begin its life as a spin-off to Assassin's Creed Black Flag, which is still considered the best title in the series. So it's clear that the team saw potential in this and wanted to make it into its own standalone game. But reactions from critics and players have been a little more skeptical. There have been a few warning signs such as the complete lack of melee combat and the inability to board enemy ships, which is especially concerning considering that seems to be the main focus of the game, seeing as there is no hand-to-hand combat. But on the bright side, the ship combat does seem to be highly customizable and not just with cosmetics. Hopefully this will lead to a solid feeling of progression as you rise through the piracy ranks.
Towards the end of your journey, you'll get the chance to become a leader yourself, unlocking the pirate lair and becoming a kingpin of the pirate black market. I'm hoping they make this really extensive, as it sounds really cool to be able to make your own pirate crew, and even get jobs done without having to get your own hands dirty, and instead just having to hire the best pirates around you, creating a true pirate fantasy. And so I think if they can really nail the progression from rags to riches, then we could really be pleasantly surprised. S.T.A.L.K.E.R 2 is a sequel to 2007's S.T.A.L.K.E.R Shadow of Chornobyl PC game, playing as a soldier stuck in an irradiated wasteland with other scavengers and horrific looking monsters.
Fitting with the conventions of the immersive sim genre, you can expect a non-linear story with multiple endings. I can already tell from the trailer that you'll be presented with the choice to align with a few different factions, which I'm sure will all have their own positives and negatives of joining up with them. It really seems like they're trying to create this open narrative where each and every choice you make is incredibly difficult, and I'm really hoping for some tough decisions with equally dire consequences. And speaking of the story, the characters have been expertly brought to life using the Unreal Engine 5, allowing the developers to create some truly impressive facial animations. Of course, the landscape is just just as beautiful and the monsters equally terrifying. So if they can really nail that feeling of dread coupled with a narrative that evolves based on your choices, I think we're in for a really unique experience. Next up, the latest title from the developers of Fallout New Vegas and The Outer Worlds, Avowed. Now this seems to be sort of their answer to Bethesda's The Elder Scrolls, with a fantasy setting as well as spellcasting.
And it's that spellcasting that's made me so interested in the combat. Dual-wielding wands, guns and melee weapons makes the combat look frantic but equally tactile and responsive. For example, in the trailer we saw the dual-wielding of a wand and a sword, in which the wand was used to freeze the enemy and then the sword brutally slashed through it, displaying how creative you can be with your choices.
And not only are you able to customize your experience through the gameplay, but also with your decisions in the story. We've already seen in trailers and gameplay demos just how many dialogue options there are with each and every character, so I'm sure, as is standard with previous Obsidian games, the world will give back as much as you put in. So if it's anywhere near the quality of Obsidian's previous titles, we have a lot of reasons to be excited.
Next up is our personal most anticipated game on this list, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. As a fan of the movies myself, just seeing Harrison Ford's face and hearing the iconic music is enough to make me very excited for this game. And although it is disappointing that Harrison Ford himself isn't voicing the character, luckily my favourite video game voice actor of all time, Troy Baker, is the person to take the role. And from what I've heard, sounds pretty good.
For me personally, what's made me even more excited is that it's being developed by Machine Games, the developers of the recent Wolfenstein games. So because of that, I am certain that they'll absolutely nail the first-person combat. And I know some people are disappointed about the perspective, but honestly, I think they've got the perfect blend of the two, with first-person for the combat and puzzles, but third-person for the parkour. The set pieces and various locations you'll be visiting also looked incredible, and within combat encounters, you'll not only be able to choose your own path, but also your approach to taking down enemies, be that stealth or all-out action, with the iconic whip not only being utilized for puzzles, but also on your unsuspecting foes.
And so I think that if they can perfect the action sequences like they have in the movies, which is looking promising as seen by the planes with the massive machine guns on the back of them that we saw in the trailer, I think we're in for a good time.
Next up is Black Myth: Wukong, an upcoming Souls-like based on the 16th century Chinese novel Journey to the West.
For me, what makes this particularly interesting is the clear inspiration of the Chinese folklore. This makes for some really uniquely grotesque enemies that definitely seem to make impressive and challenging boss fights, especially since you yourself have the ability to transform into these giant monsters and flying insects, hopefully creating a unique twist in the Souls-like genre. Dragon's Dogma 2 is a single-player narrative-driven action RPG, letting players completely personalize their experience, from their own character to AI companions, ones that when created can be placed online and hired by other players to be companions in their own games.
So even though this game does not have any form of multiplayer or online co-op, it really seems like they're trying to create this feeling of a party system, hopefully allowing you to form bonds with your allies and maximize your combat efficiency by combining their abilities. And considering that it's being developed by Capcom, I have full confidence that they'll be able to achieve this goal. It's also set in a beautiful fantasy world with incredible but terrifying creatures, many of which will probably take a lot of cooperation with your AI companions to take down. And if they're able to evoke that feeling of camaraderie in a compelling fantasy world, I think fans of the original are in for a very successful sequel. Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024 seems to take the incredibly impressive foundation established by its 2020 predecessor and builds on it by implementing a ton of new gameplay mechanics.
From the trailer we saw the addition of many new modes, for example search and rescue, air ambulance, mountain rescue, skydive aviation, and I think most excitingly, air racing, which will hopefully add a whole new level to the aviation fantasy that was created in 2020. I also think that the addition of the hot air balloon and airship experiences are going to really make this game stand out compared to its predecessor, so we'll definitely be checking it out day one on Game Pass. Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 is a new take on the classic franchise, which has recently been on a winning streak with the successes of the classic RPG Rogue Trader and the boomer shooter Boltgun.
And from the looks of it, Space Marine 2 looks to be just as good, with incredible battlefields populated by hundreds of allies and enemies, culminating in impressive set pieces and a massive amount of bloodshed. In Warhammer titles, you're often given a look at Space Marines, but rarely do you actually get the chance to possess one outside of the 2011 original. So if they're able to recreate that feeling of stepping into the shoes of a Space Marine and really utilize the leaps in graphical technology to bring that power fantasy to life, I think it has every chance to exceed the original. Little Nightmares 3 is the third entry in the puzzle platformer horror series, but this time you're given the choice to play in co-op.
It's a completely unique adventure and can be played standalone, playing as two new characters in an area called the Necropolis, which is the first part of the spiral that you'll be able to explore in Little Nightmares 3. The main enemy seems to be a monster baby, posing a threat to you and your friend as you travel through the strange world, which looks like it's going to be able to maintain that creepy environment that the previous games established. And finally, Star Wars Outlaws, an open world Star Wars game made by Ubisoft.
After watching the 10-minute gameplay showcase they did a while ago, I was initially concerned by the third-person combat. To me, it looked a little stiff, maybe a bit generic, but it did look like there were some interesting possibilities with your pet Nyx. It seemed like he could be used in combat and also in puzzles, so in that respect, it was interesting overall. But when it really piqued my interest was during the chase scene. I really liked the sort of Hitman Absolution style instinct ability, and I thought it was cool how the chase was integrated into the open world, being entirely seamless up until the cutscene. And speaking of cutscenes, unlike most Star Wars games, you are actually able to make choices. To what extent these choices will actually impact your journey is yet to be seen, but it's a cool idea and I hope it's fleshed out. We then moved on to the highlight of the showcase in my opinion, the ship combat.
After entering the ship, there's a small transition, and within a second you're in control of the ship and in space. Within the trailer we see that you're getting chased by enemies, instantly flying past with their iconic noises, and it's both that authenticity to Star Wars and that it just looked fun that made this seem enjoyable. So overall, thanks to its open world twist on the Star Wars IP, we're definitely excited.
Those were some of the biggest upcoming titles set to release in 2024. If we missed anything or you'd like to share your thoughts on what we discussed, please make sure to leave a comment below.